Hello, and welcome to Yesterday, Today, and Forever, a virtual ministry of the Churches of Christ. It is our desire to present to the 21st century person the faith of the first century Christians. We seek unity through the acceptance of the faith that was once and for all time delivered unto the saints, a system of faith which first began to be spoken by our Lord prior to his crucifixion, and was later confirmed to the saints by the apostles and inspired writers of the New Testament. Thus a faith from yesterday to today and into forever. Our speaker is Brian Barrett, who preaches for the church at Bear Branch, in Spurlockville, West Virginia. We encourage all persons interested in the faith of our fathers to open their Bibles as we search the scriptures for these eternal truths, which can lead Christians back into unity as the family of God. Now, here is Brian.
Okay, we're going to pick up again today in the book of John, chapter 10, verse 22. Last week, as we were closing up, Jesus had been talking about and had been discussing what we call the Good Shepherd. In verse 19 and 20, it says, "There was division, therefore, among the Jews for these things. And many of them said, He hath a devil, and is mad. Why hear ye him? Others said, These are not words of him that hath a devil. Can a devil open the eyes of the blind?" We still see the division that Jesus' followers had. The religious leaders trying to convince the people that he was mad, he had a devil, he was someone who was a false prophet. Just about anything they could accuse him of, they did, trying to make sure that no more followed him than they could possibly allow. They did everything. As we've seen and talked about, they threatened to throw them out of the synagogue if they confessed Jesus. And so there was much division, but you still can't ignore the fact, as some did here, how can a devil open the eyes of one who was born blind to do the things that he had been doing? So originally, as John records it, we had the man who was there at the pool of Bethesda, and he healed him and told him to take up his bed and walk, and that was on the Sabbath day, and that caused issues. Jesus met the guy who was blind from birth, anointed his eyes, he went and washed, came back seeing. Both these events took place on the Sabbath day, and there was much disagreement over the events and what the implication of that was. I'm sure more and more people were looking for Jesus, desiring Jesus, and the jealousy of the religious leaders just couldn't stand that people were looking for Jesus in the temple and looking for him in various places, following him. And they had no such following of devotees. And Jesus was kind of taken there. As they saw it, Jesus was stealing their sheep. And as Jesus saw it, they were wolves who were trying to destroy God's people. And so there was division between Jesus and the religious leaders. There was division among the religious leaders. I'm sure the people themselves, like everything else, it's religious, but it's also somewhat of a political thing. I stand with this person, I stand with that person. People divide up. And so it's social politics instead of political politics. But at the same time, there was a little bit of political stuff going on in there also. If it weren't for verse 22, we would assume that the rest of John 10 takes place at the same time. In verse 23, it tells us that Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Then came the Jews round about him and said unto him, How long dost thou make us to doubt? If thou be the Christ, tell us plainly. Jesus answered them, I told you, and you believe not. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you believe not, because you're not of my sheep. As I said unto you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And so it would be easy to connect the first part of John 10 with the second part of John 10, because in the first part of John, he's talking about sheep, and in the latter part of John 10, he's talking about sheep. But we have verse 22 that says, And it was at Jerusalem the feast of dedication, and it was winter. The previous feast that we were looking at was the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem to that. The Feast of Tabernacles usually follows, is observed in September, October, as we would think of it on our calendar. It has various implications, but it was also fall harvest festival, as well as a time when the children of Israel dwelt in tents and observed the time of tabernacles and that. And now we jump a bit, and we're told in verse 22 that Jesus is back in the temple, but this is not the next day, this is not next week, but this is the Feast of Dedication. And a Feast of Dedication, we don't usually hear it referred to today as a Feast of Dedication. There's another term that we know. What is that? Anybody know?
My book says it's dedication of the temple.
It originally was a dedication of the temple. The Jews today refer to it as Hanukkah. And it usually takes place somewhere close to Christmas. It's not always. Sometimes it overlaps, but one has nothing to do with the other, obviously. It's a Jewish festival, and the other was a created festival through the Catholics and others. Hanukkah. Hanukkah. And sometimes it's spelled CH, and sometimes it's spelled with an H, but it is the Feast of Dedication, and that has to do with the observances that took place after the Maccabees and them had dispelled the Greeks, and the temple had sort of been ransacked, and a lot of things happened. They went back in, they cleaned up the temple, they rededicated it to the service of the Lord. There was said in Jewish tradition, because this takes place in the intertestament between Malachi and Matthew, so we don't really have that in the Bible itself. There is some writings of Maccabees and others which are not in the modern Bibles, but they are and were included in the original King James. But nonetheless, they purged the temple. They got rid of the Greeks. They purged the temple. They rededicated it to the service of God. And it's said that there was a special oil that was used in the menorahs, and they only had one cask of the oil, which normally it should not have lasted more than a day, but it said that it lasted 8 days until they were able to appropriate the type of oil, olive oil, that they needed to use in the menorah. And so, yes?
6. The menorah.
7. The original one had 7. And and one in the middle.
He's talking about that back during Christmas.
Right. And during Hanukkah, they have a special Hanukkah, what we would think of as a Hanukkah menorah, but it has 8. And the purpose of that is for the 8 days of Hanukkah and the 8 days of the oil. So anyway, we're a couple months passed. We were in the fall when Jesus was talking in the first part of the 10th chapter as he was there with them. And now we're about 2 months later into the Feast of Dedication. We're told it was winter. Winter is a cooler time, but in that particular part of the world, while there may be some snow in areas, it's usually rainy season. And so it's a time that, and it tells us he was on Solomon's porch. Solomon's porch had a roof on it. In some places in the temple, the main court of the Gentiles, if you were just in the main court, it had no roof. And some of the courts of the women and the courts of the men, likewise, they may have had a little place, but Solomon's porch was a much larger place, and it would allow them to get out of the rain and some of the weather. And so we're specifically told by John that it was again at the Feast of Dedication. Jesus was there. And so if anybody ever says that, we don't have any proof that Jesus observed Hanukkah, well, here's the verse. Here's the verse that Jesus, as a Jew, observed Hanukkah. And it was a holiday, a celebration, a holy day that was developed during the intertestament period, as we know it, as I said. And so he's there walking on the porch, Solomon's porch, and the Jews, and we would say the Jewish leaders primarily, those who were directing the show, they came around about him. It was a place where various rabbis and teachers would come into the temple, and they would interact with disciples and various people. It was a place where the rabbis and Jewish teachers could come into Solomon's porch, and since that was connected to the court of the Gentiles could easily have access to the Jewish teachers, and they could come down. Those who were interested could come down and they could teach. Jewish people could listen, and of course the Gentiles got to hear things about God, the God of Israel. And Jesus was walking there, and it's interesting, if thou be the Christ, tell us plain. Why don't you just tell us? Now, he told the woman at the well that he was the Messiah, and he told the man who he gave sight to that he was the Messiah. He had his disciples in Matthew 16 when he asked them, who do men say that I am? And ultimately Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he blessed him for his insight. And it wasn't through flesh and blood that he learned that, but a revelation of the things of God. And it's interesting that they're there. There's a mixture, a blend, if you will, of some of the Jews and some of the Gentiles, and religious leaders and various individuals are there. And so they just say, tell us plainly. Just come right out and say the words. He had said many different things. It's interesting, Jesus answered them, I told you, and you believe not. I haven't really kept it a big secret. He didn't stand on the pinnacle of the temple and yell it to the four winds, but he didn't hide anything. And when people confessed that, he acknowledged it. And he, like I said, he told some individuals plainly and openly that he was, the Christ. And he tells them, I told you and you believe not. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. Whether I tell you or not, as we've seen at the closing part of what would have been the period of the tabernacles, when he said, they said, can a devil open the eyes of the blind back in 20 One, Jesus said, the works that I do, they testify of me. It shouldn't be hard for you to understand. But the issue is not what Jesus had to say or whether Jesus was speaking to them clearly. He says, ye believed not. And therein lies the difference. If we make a conscious decision not to believe in something, we won't. And many times, no matter what evidence, if we just can't believe or accept the fact that you are the Messiah, nothing you do is going to convince me. And this is the same situation many times that we get into when it comes to the subject of baptism. People say, well, I just cannot believe that baptism has anything to do with the remission of sins. And you know what? You never will. It doesn't matter how many scriptures you read, whoever taught you whatever it is that you do believe, you will not allow anything else to challenge that belief. And so these religious leaders did not believe the things that he was saying, not because they weren't necessarily true. It's just they didn't believe. They didn't want to believe. They wouldn't accept those things. They would not weigh the evidence. And because of that, to them, no matter, he could stand on the pinnacle of the temple and he could scream to the four winds and blow a trumpet, and all the people of Israel could acknowledge him as the Messiah, and it still wasn't going to do any good. Now, how do I know that? Well, just before Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus came into the city of Jerusalem, and what did the people do? On his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, what did the people do? They basically rolled out the red carpet. They laid their clothes down in front of him. They cut palm branches and laid it in a way. They were all cheering and singing Jesus and Hosanna, to God, deliver us. All the people were publicly making a spectacle and acknowledgement of Jesus. But a week later, he's on the cross. Less than a week later, he's on the cross. So Jesus says, I told you, and you believe not because, you don't believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you believe not because you're not my sheep, as I said unto you. This is an interesting statement in many ways. First of all, Jesus was the God of Israel, and Israel was his sheep. They were his special people. And Jesus said, you're not my sheep. Now, in that sense, that's a pretty strong statement, because that tells us why there was so much division was because they really weren't interested in following the things of God like maybe they thought they were. Because had they been, they would have been his sheep. And had they been his sheep, they would have heard his voice. But they were sheep that belonged to someone else, whoever that someone else was, whether it was the high priest of that time, the Sanhedrin council, whatever it is, but they were not his sheep. Now, bringing it down to his flesh and blood, those who were willing to listen, starting, as we said, in the Sermon on the Mount that we have in Matthew 5, going through 7, The people were astonished at his doctrine. They followed him both for the miracles and for his teachings and lots of different reasons. They had no problems accepting that the things that he was doing were the things of God. And he said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Now, it sounds like he's just continuing, like I said, what he previously said, but he's going back to something that he's already taught there a couple months ago. And he's reminding them of what he said when he was there before. "I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand." Now, we have to understand that we can die. We're going to die, and that's going to happen, but that will not separate us. Paul says, what can separate us from the love of Christ? And, we got trials, tribulations, perils, even death itself cannot separate us from the love of God or from Christ. And so, excuse me, there's nothing that anyone can do. No one, no man, no person is able to take them out of my hand, whether that's the Sanhedrin Council, whether that is, the high priest, whether it's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, whoever it is, not going to happen. Yes.
Now, when he came into the city, that was the indication that was going to be a new king. Where's the king coming in? Because he's got to figure out a way to get rid of him too.
Yeah. So, Herod was another issue, Pilate, Romans, lots of different things going on with Jesus and acknowledging him. But in 29, he says, "My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all. No man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand." Can't take them from me. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to discourage the sheep that were following Jesus. They were trying to, as he said, pluck them out of his hand, trying to yank them from his grasp. When the shepherd sees a sheep that's going astray, lay hold on it. Of course, he had the shepherd's crook to put around its neck if you had to yank it in the right direction, but he had control over them. So Jesus said, "No one is able to take them out of my hands or out of my control or from following me." And at the same time, he talks about the Father, which gave them him. They didn't give them to him, they gave him to them. Going back to John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. "My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all. No man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. I and my Father are one." So here is another one of those declarations for those who say that Jesus never said that he was God. He never said he was equal to God, whatever. Jesus here clearly says, "I and my Father are one."
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in his truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.